Journalists are great at asking questions because that is central to their job. If you're running a podcast and you're interviewing people, asking questions is important. So I thought it would be great if we brought on a journalist and talked about how asking questions in journalism can translate into podcasts. Stay tuned. It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. I'm excited today because I have with me Greg Levinsky. He is a freelance journalist in the Maine, Massachusetts area. He's a content marketer. He also co-hosts the Starting Five podcast, which covers high school basketball throughout the state of Maine. I also had the chance to work with Greg for a while at a previous company. I always appreciated his writing, always appreciated interacting, his questions, just really enjoyed working with him. Two quick items before we jump into today's show. First, go to buildthatpodcast.com and you can sign up for a free 4-email course on the power and flexibility of podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence. Second, you can DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford. Would love to hear from you and answer any questions that you have. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Greg, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It is my pleasure. Now, you've been a journalist both full-time and freelance. You've been a freelance journalist now for the last few years. What was sort of a motivating factor for studying journalism and pursuing being a journalist?
Yeah, so the story is definitely pretty clear. When I was growing up, my dad did some freelance writing for some of the local papers, and every once in a while we get to go down to Boston. So I live in Portland, Maine, it's 2 hours from Boston. And, like you get to go to the Red Sox or the Celtics or whatever, and write a story usually with a Maine kind of angle. So, there's a coach from Maine or player from Maine or whatever. And I thought it was pretty cool. And I never, it was always kind of in the back of my mind that was cool. And then my senior year of high school in the fall of 2016, my dad was freelancing for one of the local papers and they asked him if he could cover some high school football games. And he had a previous commitment for Friday night, so he couldn't do it. But he kind of encouraged / like voluntold, I know that's a word that we're familiar with, me to do it. I was a good student and I like sports. So I did that at the Journal Tribune, which is no longer exists in York County, Maine. But it was awesome. I remember the first game I covered was, it was high school football and some basketball and stuff like that. And I just kind of thought, wow, this could be a career, very wide-eyed and kind of unaware of how journalism really works sometimes. But yeah, that's kind of the start of it, was just sort of being volunteered to do it. And I thought it was super cool. I mean, at the time I knew I was in high school, so obviously I knew a lot of the players on teams from around the state, and they thought it was really cool that I was doing it. And I thought it was really cool that I was covering their games and stuff like that. And it kind of all just built off of that experience.
I love that. And so it sounds like it took off. You found your niche. It just felt right. And so what fields do you report on? Is it sports? Is it specific sports? Is it other stuff? Where do you report?
So, I mean, I have experience doing kind of every sport. I also did a year. So my only full-time experience as a reporter, kind of weirdly, is not in sports. It was at the Morning Sentinel, Quebec Journal, kind of Maine Today Media in Central Maine, covering news. And that was mostly during like the height of the pandemic. So it's kind of weird that I always sort of envision myself being a sports reporter, and I've never actually done it full time. I don't know if I ever will, honestly. But at this point, like this moment in time, I do a twice a month human interest kind of sports feature for the Portland Phoenix, which is our local alt weekly. And I kind of do that on a variety of things. And it's really not like sports X's and O's. It's finding the interesting story about, this local high school. I mean, for example, one coming up tomorrow or later this week is like a local high school wrestler who's deaf and how he became, a wrestler and how he was able to kind of do that. Or I did one recently on a girl who plays soccer at a small college here, who like launched her own clothing line and wants to kind of have a clothing design sort of thing. So a lot of it's not really, it's kind of, it's backbone by sports, but it's not like, why are the Celtics not trade whatever? And that's my favorite for sure. And then this winter, I've been very busy with some local high school basketball stuff. There's just really cool. It started as a social media outlet that was started during COVID by this guy who lives in Central Maine named Tom Bard. It's called Big Time Hoops Maine, and it has like 18,000 followers on Instagram. So when I was kind of looking for stuff to do this winter, he and I have been chatting for a while about maybe some potential opportunities for me with to kind of, have it be a mutually beneficial. I'm by no means famous, but I think in this small pond, I'm a fairly large fish, if you will, just because there aren't very many people who report on sports in a small state. And there aren't very many who are like kind of younger and are in touch with the kids. So basically, myself and my good friend Taylor Mannix, who hosts the midday sports radio show 5 days a week here in Portland, decided to do a high school basketball podcast that we do once a week. So we'll be recording that later today, actually. And it's done really well. We've had well over 1,000 listeners per episode for Maine high school basketball. We have sponsors. So it's pretty cool. And so I do that. I've been writing some like longer feature stories for him. It's kind of been a lot of stuff that I do, and I'm a really big fan of covering basketball for a few reasons. The first reason is kind of funny is that it's climate controlled and that the games last a certain and the games are usually like, you kind of know how long they're going to. I've covered a lot of high school sports, football games, soccer games, and early spring lacrosse and baseball where it's 32 degrees and rainy and crappy out. That's no fun. And the other reason I love basketball is I think that basketball is one of the most, if not the most inclusive sport of people from all backgrounds that you can find. People from all countries, people from all sort of socioeconomic backgrounds, demographics and stuff like that. So I love basketball the most to cover for two very different reasons. One for convenience sake, but more importantly for the storytelling sake. I think basketball has by far the best stories, and that's why I really like it. So I love basketball season. It's like every year since I started college, I've been very involved in something. I worked at the Boston Globe my sophomore, junior, senior year of college, and then sort of a little bit last year too, covering mostly college basketball, but I was up here. So I decided to not do that this year just because when I do something I want to be like 10 toes in, and if I'm not going to be at the games in person, I didn't feel I was going to be doing the best job. So I'm really proud that like one of my best friends from college who's a couple years younger than me still in Boston's doing it, so it's pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, I love basketball, but I do any sports. I just like kind of I don't like X's and O's. I never try to fancy myself as some savant in terms of sports, but I think that there's a lot of great stories that like transcend sports but start in sports, and that's kind of my favorite.
I love that. And so, man, just a whole lot we could unpack there. First was that first, just as a side note, I totally get the climate control thing. I respect that, so I'm in Tennessee, so we're in the South, but it's not like Texas, but it's still like summer's unpleasant. So I totally get the winter sport thing. Let's just be inside when we're in Maine.
Yeah.
Totally get that as as a reason. But it sounds like too, you're writing a bunch of you're looking at stories as a story. It's not facts, it's not figures, it's not stats. I mean, some of those are included, but it sounds like some of your favorites are really some of the human interest where you really have this narrative going on.
Yeah, I just like to humanize people. I think that that's really important. And one of the reasons I've had really great opportunities to cover pro sports and college sports throughout when I was in college and after, some of which I've taken up on a freelance basis, none of which I've taken up as a full-time job, because I think for me, I love doing high school and small college sports because you can for a few reasons. You can get raw emotions much differently. Your access is extremely great. And people appreciate it. We've been doing these twice a month, these for that big time hoops thing. We've been doing these cover stories, and we've had some really fun opportunities where I had some extra time in November, and a really awesome young man named Brady King, who is a college student and was home on break. We did kind of photo shoots for a lot of these. So, my favorite one I published about a week ago. We went out there's a school called Old Orchard Beach, and they have two really good seniors basketball players. So we brought them to the beach in their uniform, took photos. It was awesome. And I wrote this really long story about, like how, not super long, like 1,200 words or whatever, feature story about how, how close they are. For instance, third grade, they've had like, the same exact career arc, starter since their freshman year, both to score their 1,000th point. And the mother or sent this really nice message to me being like, just thank you, whatever. And then yesterday, when the boy scored his 1,000th point, the girl messaged me and was like, "You were right. Like, we're always in lockstep or whatever." And, if you did that same story on, two Titans wide receivers or whatever, they're not even going to read it. They don't care. They don't want you around. And I think it's great that athletes and famous people have their own way to speak and they don't need the media to speak for them or speak on their behalf. But there's still a great opportunity for the storytelling at a lower level of sports. And it means more people. And these kids will never probably get an article written about them again. Or maybe they do. Maybe they get quoted after a championship game, but they're once they go to college, they probably won't get anything or any attention. And I think that it's a really valuable opportunity for me to do that. And I also think it's good for the kids because they get some attention, some support, and also some practice in terms of public speaking, interviews, and stuff like that. So I really love it. And I think that, well, I don't know if I'll ever do it full time just because of the realities of, people don't want to pay for news and certainly don't want to pay for news about high school sports. But I think that I will probably do it on at least, I like to say it's a hobby that I get paid not well for, but it's okay because it's a hobby and it's a hobby I just happen to be professionally trained at. So, maybe someday if there's some opportunity that comes down the road, I would definitely pursue it. But I'm one who likes to live in reality too. So we'll see.
Now, and I love the fact you're serving a community. You've got a niche that you're focused on. You're building skills, even if it's not great paid hobby. You're still building some amazing skills doing that because
and they're directly translatable to like my real job, right? I think that's the biggest thing about this is that they're not mutually exclusive. Like these things overlap in so many ways, the writing, the communication, the interviewing. And I think what has made me a marketable candidate since leaving journalism full time is that sort of journalistic approach to in-house marketing content. And I think that I'm very prideful and maybe almost in some ways a little bit stubborn about trying to want to do things with the journalist's eye because I think that I'm a little bit of you become a little bit of a cynic or a little bit of a skeptic. But I think that makes the most authentic storytelling, whether it's from a brand's perspective or from, a very down and narrow news perspective. I think that the skills are mutually beneficial. And it's important to note that when I was in college, I always was like, oh, I'm gonna be a reporter and then I'm gonna make no money. And then at age 30, I'm gonna, go figure something out and whatever. And then COVID changed things. And I ended up, obviously getting a kind of a corporate marketing job at 23 that had a good amount of responsibility, I would think, for my age. I mean, I worked with you there. And I don't know. I think that I didn't really realize the skills I was gaining in journalism were A, valuable, and B, especially translatable to other areas. So, I mean, I think that's a big lesson and takeaway for me. And I think that you always hear, I graduated college in 2020, so 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago or whatever. And you always hear that people say, oh, well, I don't do what I studied in college. And I never thought I'd be one of those people. And I am to an extent, but I'm really not because I'm doing the same type of work. It's just for a different sort of outlet or a different sort of, voice.
Yeah, and it is translatable in so many ways, and I don't think I appreciated that. I do now within marketing because it's storytelling. You create a narrative arc. You're trying to tell the story about people, and you really need to think from the audience perspective. What are they hearing? What are they sensing? And it's huge. I do want to jump back real quick because you said you guys do a weekly high school basketball podcast. Yeah. What's the name of that? Let's give a shout out.
It's called the Starting Five Podcast.
Sweet.
And basically what we do is Taylor and I, we have 5 big topics every week. So like our starting 5, but then we touch on players of the week, big performances, games to watch, stuff like that. And the coaches and parents love it. The players, the players definitely listen when they know they're in it. I don't know how much the kids really listen to it, but it definitely fits a void because we have some, there's some traditional media here that cover, games and stuff like that. And our whole thing is kind of going a little bit, I like to, zag where other people zig or whatever you want to, whatever cliche you want to use to describe what that means. That's kind of my thing. I like to write about stuff that people maybe won't think about first. And sometimes I see that people will write about it very quickly after. And that means that I did it right.
I love it. Yeah, but I mean,
it happened yesterday. I saw an article that was, I don't want to say what it was, but there was an article that I had written kind of similarly about not the same subject, but like a friend of the same subject who did the same thing like 8 months ago. And now it's just coming out today. I'm like, wow. And I'm not the full-time reporter, but
that's awesome. That's awesome.
I'm definitely competitive.
Oh, that's awesome. But even with the podcast, right? You're going with non-traditional media. You're trying to reach an audience which may not read your writing, other writing, but they're going to listen to a podcast.
Exactly.
And so you're able to take content and expand it to places it might not normally go.
Yeah, I do have to give though a lot. Like we've been very successful, and I think that Taylor and I have done a good job. But I do have to give a lot of credit to Tom, who started that outlet, because he basically gave us a platform that already had across different social medias almost 30,000 followers. I mean, it could have been the same people, one person on Facebook, one person on Twitter, whatever. But like we Taylor and I were given a leg up than if we just started our own thing on no platform. So we had a platform that was given to us and built like spoon fed, and all we had to do was execute. So credit to him for building that platform, because that made us take off. And if we were doing the same thing and and that wasn't like shared on that platform every day, and he makes these graphics and stuff, and it wouldn't, we would not get 1,000 listeners a podcast. There's no way. Like people, I mean, sure, Taylor's pretty well known in the community because he's a radio host every day. And I think I'm decently well known in the community for sports stuff. But, the people people don't realize how big of a state Maine is geographically, like compared to the rest of New England. The people who live 350 miles away in Aroostook County, they would never find our podcast if it wasn't for Big Time Hoops. And I take zero credit in building that brand. I did nothing. Now I'm sure I'm complimenting it, I guess, but like, it has nothing to do with me. We were given it. We were given a golden opportunity that we had to capitalize on it, right? Like we had to do it. We had to capitalize on it, and we've gotten sponsors, which backs up the fact that we've capitalized on it. But we were definitely given a really good launching point.
True, but at the same time, like I like how you said you've complemented what was already there, but you did build, because I've seen some platforms that have tried to launch podcasts and they fall flat. And some things don't translate from one medium to another. So yeah, it sounds like there was work already in place, but it sounds like you guys have used that and built on top of it, which is no mean feat. That's really exciting.
Yeah, no, it's been really cool. I'm always surprised when this doesn't happen that often, but maybe like once an episode, somebody will like reach out or tweet at me or whatever, Taylor, and be like, oh, like, it's usually with a mistake, which is fine. I'm happy to be corrected, because like we don't do this full time. We can't monitor basketball in a massively, it's a massively geographic state. Like there's no news outlets up there. Like sorry, like we can't, we're not gonna get everything. So like we like to hear if we pronounce the kid's name wrong. We try our best, we try to reach out, but if we don't hear back, it's what it is. But I'm amazed how many people listen. I'm like, wow, this person actually like picked that out. That's crazy.
It's like, yeah, it's like whoa, people are listening. We're getting feedback, and that's exciting.
It is, for sure. And it's really cool that people have actually like listened. I'm very surprised. I'm honestly surprised that we get as many people to listen to it as we do. Just because, I mean, like, when I was writing for the newspaper or whatever, if we got 1,000 clicks on an article, that was a big deal. And that was an established outlet with like subscribers, and not just like very niche Maine high school basketball, which is extremely niche. It's a very popular sport here, even though we're not like the best at it in terms of producing college players or whatever. But like people love it. Basketball tournament's a big deal because it's so statewide. But yeah, it's been really cool that people have listened. I mean,
no, it's great. And it is, I love the fact that it is very niche focused. And then so as you're thinking about whether it's a podcast, whether it's writing an article, as you begin reporting and discussing, how do you think about the story? Do you think of it in certain parts? Is it formulaic? Or does it depend on the questions you ask?
It depends on the situation. I mean, there are certain stories stories can come up to me in different ways. Like sometimes they can be spoon fed and handed right to me. Sometimes they can be uncovered by me. Sometimes they can be uncovered by someone else. And like, you never know. There's so many examples of, there's been times where, hey, this kid's really good. I wonder if there's something interesting about them. And then you kind of dig in and ask the questions. You ask the coach maybe, hey, like, what's up with this kid? Is anything interesting? What does he do on the side? Whatever. Sometimes it's, hey, there's this really interesting kid, but they may not play much. Either one's valid. I don't care. And then in terms of like story arc or things structure, sometimes it comes in the weirdest places. Like I'll be like driving somewhere and it'll come in my head like, oh, that's the lead of that story. Like, shit, pull over. Like gotta write that down on my phone or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So yeah, I mean, in terms of it's not formulaic because it depends on the story for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's really just a case by case basis, I think. I think that even though I'm 24, I mean, I'm not like super old, but I'm also not 16, and that like I've done it. I have enough experience where I'm confident that each story should play out as it should be told rather than fitting into a specific bucket. Because if it fits into a specific bucket or can be templatized, then it's going to be boring. No one's
No,
going
that makes sense. Yeah, and it sounds like you've got enough repetitions of the creative process and the publishing and everything else that you have
Yeah.
a feel for where you're going.
Yeah, I think it's important too to just monitor if things are working or not, using metrics. Sometimes I'll write a great story and I'll think it's amazing and I'll see the clicks and I'll be like, wow, that sucks. Or sometimes it'll be a situation where I don't think it's that great of a story, but maybe the writing isn't the best, but the story's so interesting to people that it gets more clicks. So sometimes, even though you might like something better or be more interested in something, the end of the day is you're not writing it necessarily for yourself. You're writing it for your audience that hopefully is going to, then subscribe and obviously which ends up with dollar signs. So you have to kind of take the pulse of the people looking at your stuff. If it's, truly, if it's not a hobby, if it's for your business or whatever, you have to be able to evaluate what works and then adjust if it doesn't because the only person, if you're the only person that cares about something, then you're not going to get other people to care about it. You have to figure out what other people care about and then maybe restructure what you know to fit in that lens in a lot of ways, unless you're, have a cult following, which most people don't.
Do you host a regular Twitter Spaces event either each week or every other week? If so, are you using that content in a podcast? Because if you're not, you're losing a valuable source of information for your audience, for your community, and it is just evaporating into the ether. I've got a solution for you. Go to spacestopodcast.com. That's spaces topodcast.com and sign up for more information about a course I'm launching this February about how to take and build a podcast from your existing Twitter Spaces. We'll go into the details not only of gaining the recording, but creating an intro and outro and lots of other information. Again, spacestopodcast.com. It's in the show notes. Sign up and get more information. As you're thinking about a news story or any of those, do you have standard questions? Are they different every time? I know you just kind of mentioned, it's like in your mind, you're like, oh, I wonder if.
Yeah. I mean, other than the basics, it's always different. I mean, obviously you need like, name, age, whatever. But other than the basics, it's always different because it depends on the story, depends on how the information I already know going into talking to people. I think a lot of times something that gets lost is that people think that they can get a great story or a great interview just by like reaching out and then doing it. And I think that there's a lot of work that needs to go before that. You need to do some research on the people, obviously, but you also should talk to people around the main subject of a story. I think that's the most obvious thing that people miss all the time is that if you're going to do an article on, in the example of when we were working together, if somebody was going to do an article on you, right? Like maybe somebody would call up me and be like, hey, like what's Eric like to work with? Call up, the boss. What's Eric like to work with? Call up a different coworker who did a different job than me, but also was on the team. What's Eric like to work with? And then going into the conversation with you, maybe you got this great anecdote. All right, for example, remember early in our tenure, we had a project that was like very important and we had to go, go, go. It was me and you on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like super important, had to get it done yesterday thing. I assume you know what I'm talking about.
I do. Yes. I remember that one vividly.
Okay, good. So like that's an example, right? So maybe if somebody was writing the story on you and they interviewed me, I would bring that up. And maybe that would be the lead into the story on Eric. Like, it was whatever day it was, and the walls are falling down and or whatever, and not really, it wasn't that dramatic, but like whatever, that could be the lead into this, like telling that anecdote about how he's a great coworker because we worked together on this and we never met in real life and whatever, but we executed it really well and it did well and all that stuff. And to ask you about that, situation might be helpful, or to just have my quote about you in that. So I think it's important to not just, you have to do more than just talk to the main subject. I mean, obviously, if you're just going to interview someone on a podcast like this, it's still a bit different, but read about the person or whatever. I mean, you've experienced it, me, but if you were someone you never knew, you want to, I think it's important. You gotta get the whole circle. You can't just do that. Cause then I think it almost seems like you're not as interested or maybe a little bit disingenuous in some ways.
No, I appreciate that. I like that. Sorry, I realized I thought my mic was muted. I like that, how you're looking at outside people, you talk to other people, and I like how you made that bridge too between the podcast, because you can do, it is a little different medium, but you still want to do research. You still want to see where they're at, what they're doing, what they've written, what they've said, at least to draw in those experiences and questions.
Yeah. And I think too, I don't know, it depends on what the purpose is, but reaching out to people ahead of something like a formal interview or whatever, I think shows that you're human rather than just, I think it's funny when you get, and I guess I'm kind of on the other side of this, and I would never really do it this way, but as a reporter, even now I still get these emails, even though I'm not a full-time reporter, these PR pitches, talk to this woman or this guy or this person who wrote this book about something that has nothing to do with anything I ever knew about, and I've just got on some email list or whatever. I never respond. And if I do, rarely, I'll say, what does this have to do with, what I write about? And then there's no response from the PR person. And I think that is a clear, just whenever I get those, I usually don't even read them. Even if maybe one has been good, but 99 have not. So I think it's important, not just from the journalist perspective or the storyteller's perspective, but from the perspective of marketing, wanting to get your story out. You can't just tell your own story. You got to get other people to tell it for you. And that's something that I know I was very passionate about working with you. And I've always been that way. And I'm going to continue to be that way when I'm on this side of the house, is telling the story through the eyes of, in this case, the customer, right? Because when Greg Levinsky, whatever my brand is, it's Greg Levinsky jeans. When I say, oh, I'm Greg Levinsky, and Greg Levinsky's jeans are the best, no one cares, right? But when you get LeBron James wears my jeans, I'm LeBron James. Greg Levinsky's jeans, fit me so well, and I'm 6'9", and I can't find jeans in the store. Not saying that they're the best, but saying how they fix his issues or solve his problems. That's the way to do it. You need real people. I mean, obviously people can't relate to LeBron, but people love LeBron, or some regular person that you can relate to in sort of a business setting. But I think it's important to have kind of, I think they call them influencers, I guess, technically in marketing, but it's not necessarily influencers, it's just people.
True. And I think that's so true. And I think if you can have the real people, if you can hear their plight and help them to see, a solution, if you can serve them in that capacity, it goes such a long way. And that's and it's all storytelling. It's all storytelling.
It's funny. I don't know. I think it's interesting that all the people I went to school with majored in journalism or whatever, all these people had these skills, and I don't think a lot of them have realized how valuable they are. I know we talked about that earlier, and it's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I hope that, the audience of this podcast are probably people who are not necessarily trained in journalism. And I hope that if they are hiring for content marketing, storytelling type roles, that if they see a journalist's resume, should be, compared to someone who has in their MBA and has, was a marketing specialist 2 and 3 and 4 or whatever, that journalism resume, I hope at least has equal weight, at least. And if not, maybe value a little bit higher. But that's just me.
No, and it's true, because you learn how to ask questions, you learn how to write, and you're always, I mean, internally in any business, you're always having to do that. You ask questions, you're trying to get more feedback,
you're
trying
to get
information.
Deadlines, any corporate deadline I've had so far is nothing compared to now. Some of these sports deadlines are not the end of the world, but it's Boston Globe, go to a game, it starts at 6 and your deadline's at 8 and the game's ending at 7:55. All right, what do? You write during the game, get a couple quotes, pop it in. It's only 300 words. That's all right. That's what they want. But the deadline meeting thing. There's always questions. Oh, how are you with deadlines? Well, if you work in journalism, you're really good with deadlines. The deadlines are not days in journalism, they're minutes. That's the thing that I think that gets lost too, is that the speed in which you can do something. Now, maybe, all right, like maybe my thing won't be as perfect as yours or whoever's, but if I can do 98% of it in a day and the person who gets the 100% takes 3 weeks, I personally would rather have the 98% in the day take 10 minutes to go over it and it's done versus 3 weeks later you get it back and it's great, but we lost 2.5 weeks there. So I don't know. And then maybe that's just me. I mean, obviously I'm gonna say that because of who I am, but I think it's valid.
I think it's a good reminder too. I think sometimes we can get stuck in that perfectionism thing, and sometimes good enough. It's good enough. It's good enough to ship, right? That's the thing.
The more, especially too, like if it's independent, the more you look at something over and over and over and over again, it's just you're gonna like drive yourself in circles.
You will. So how do you? Is there a difference between a good question and a weak question when you talk to people? I mean, how do you? What's the difference?
Avoiding yes. I mean, I'm trying to avoid a yes or no question if that's not the
Okay.
answer you're looking for, I think is the biggest one. And I would say that's the biggest thing is avoiding the yes or no question if you don't want. I mean, if it's a yes or no answer, then sure. Like if if you want to say, are you 5'2" or 5'4"? And they say, yes, I'm 5'2". Okay, all right, whatever. But if you want more than a yes or no, you got to phrase the question differently than a yes or no. And one other thing I would say is that I think the no bad question thing is legit. However, they may not be a bad question to the person you're asking them to, but as a question, as an asker of those questions, I think you can ask bad questions and learn from that. There's one perfect example, I think. So I've covered a lot of high school state championship games. And I think that the worst question, and this is going to sound weird, but the worst question you can ask a kid after they win the state championship is, how does this feel? Because they're going to say, great, amazing, wonderful, whatever. Now, find a different way to ask that question because it's sure they're going to feel great and amazing. And that's what every kid's going to say, right? Like, find something different. Find something, oh, like your team, whatever. You guys lost 5 in a row earlier in the year, and now you're state champions. What do you say to the people that doubted you after those 5 game losing streak? You're going to get a way better answer, right? Than just like, how does it feel? So that's like a good example, I think, of like, is it a bad question? No, it's the right question, but it's not the right way to phrase it because you're just going to get it feels great. He said, she said, they said, whatever. That's my one thing is I always like love to read after state championships for like high school basketball or whatever, and like the Globe or the Portland Press Herald or whatever. And like, you can tell when the question was, how does it feel? Because it feels great, comma, Eric said, period. I'm so proud of our team, period, quotation mark. Like, it's every time. So
It's
that's
like
that's
you could have answered that for them, right?
right. And that's you don't want to be able to do that. You don't want to foreshadow the answer in your own head because then you're not telling the story, you're telling your story, and that's not what you want to do. So
No, but that's huge. Now, is that as you're thinking about this idea of the better way to ask a question, is that something people can learn? Is that just take practice? Does it
yeah, I mean, it
how
depends
does
on the
that
setting
work?
too, right? Like it takes practice for sure. And kind of, I mean, it's like, I think a lot of it is if you have a question that you thought was good and you got a bad answer, but you know that they weren't trying to give you a bad answer, like, they were trying to give you a good answer, think of what the question was again. And maybe next time ask it a different way. Obviously, you'll be in some settings, especially as a reporter, where people aren't going to not want to talk to you or they're not going to want to say stuff. But if you're kind of, a lot of this, I mean, for better or for worse, almost everything, everything I do now is like, positive. It's like, it's, overcoming adversity or really cool accomplishment and stuff like that. I'm never out to get these people. But if their answers kind of stink, they're not trying to give you bad answers. You might be asking like not great questions. I think that's one of the lessons. It's especially hard in live settings where like, I do the sideline report. I did it last year. I just signed up again this year to do they televise the main state championship basketball games. And you do the sideline reporting and like, it's after the game and to win the state championship. And it's like, you're just really going to ask, how does it feel? No, you got to find something. And I don't know. I think that and I definitely have reflected on those interviews for this year where like I'm really gonna. I think I did ask how does it feel at least twice, and I don't want to ask that anymore. Like I had 4 games. I got to find a different way. How does it feel?
Well, no, but it's cool that you recognize that, you see that, and you're like, ooh, I've done it. As the repetitions happen,
Exactly.
hey, I've learned. Now I need to tweak it and I need to adjust as we go.
Exactly. No, exactly. And because a lot of times you're looking for that money quote, that great quote. The great quote's not usually, especially when you're dealing with people who don't speak publicly often, the great quote's not going to come from like a very basic question. You have to get questions that are going to get people to elaborate and talk. So in that state championship example, again, maybe bring up past context or whatever. And obviously, you don't want to make a kid look bad and like have them say something that they're going to regret saying, but you want to make the kid be able to verbalize their emotions. And emotions usually are much more than, oh, it was good. I feel good. No, you don't. You feel like you're on top of the world. You're a 16-year-old kid. You scored 30 points in the state championship game. Like you feel more than good, you know?
Yeah, one adjective doesn't cover it. You got to give me more than that.
Right. Or like, my dad played in this and he always told me he was never gonna, I was never gonna do as well as him in this game. And look at me or whatever. I don't know. There's all kinds of great stories that can happen, but you have to like look for them a little bit. You can't just expect them to fall into your lap.
But it sounds like too, it's just the stories are there, the conversations are there. So even whether it's reporting, whether it's doing an interview for a podcast or other types of mediums, part of it is doing some research. Part of it is trying to learn how to ask good questions, and that happens over time with the reps. And then just trying to get people to elaborate and just hear from their point of view. Am I tracking with you?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, yeah, and I think it's also valuable to listen to stuff. Like, they say if you want to be a good writer, read. If you want to be a good interviewer, listen to interviews. I mean, I think that's all valid, and you can learn, pick different styles and whatever. And it's funny, my friend group, because we all study journalism, we definitely pick apart like that sideline interview was so weird. And then like my mom or dad or my other friends who don't journalism be like, what? Who cares? Like it's fine. So I think you kind of have to almost. I think one of my things that I don't like about myself, but is also helpful in the workplace is like I can't really turn it off. And like I'm always hyper analyzing everything. And I think that's sure it's good, but it's also not great. So that's the thing I'm trying to work on with myself is like, take a step back. Because sometimes when you can take that step back, you do come back with fresher eyes and whatever. And like when you have the time to do it, it's good. Like back to the thing where I was like, oh, like being fast is so great. It's true, but there are times where it's important to take that step back. And with a journalism background, you never usually get that opportunity. But so when you have that opportunity, you can definitely do it, but you have to balance it, I guess. And that's something I'm still learning is like, when is it full throttle? When is it not? And when does the value outweigh, waiting versus going faster?
It's a tough balance to try and figure out.
Yeah.
And I know as a marketer too, like my marketing brain never turns off, like
No,
ever. And it's like, oh, it's like I never look at anything with neutral eyes. So
no, yeah. I have a judgment about everything, for better or for worse.
I know, me too. Me too. So as we wrap things up here, if listeners want to know more about you, more about your podcast, more about where you're writing, where to follow you, where do you want them to go?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on Twitter for the sports stuff, which is at Greg Levinsky, so just my name. LinkedIn, I think I'm Gregory Levinsky on there technically. I'm pretty active on there too. I don't post all of my journalism stuff on LinkedIn, but I post stuff that is more like would have kind of appeal, I would say, to a lot of if you're not a huge sports fan, but you enjoy like storytelling and stuff, and don't hate sports. I'm not live updating LinkedIn for the high school basketball games I go to. I do that on Twitter because people are interested in it, but not people on LinkedIn. Like nobody would want to see that. So those are the two places I would say are kind of the best sort of mediums for me, are Twitter and LinkedIn.
Cool. And then one more shout out on your podcast.
Starting Five podcast is a big time hoops podcast network and actually presented by Town and Country Federal Credit Union.
All right. Hey, there, absolutely. If you make it to the point where you're able to get sponsors for your podcast, that is a significant step. And so huge shout out and kudos to the work you're doing for that. So
yeah, we got the gamut. It's kind of funny. We got them. We got Casella Waste Systems. We have Next Gen Fitness, and then we have Law Offices of Joe Bornstein. So we're very diverse in our.
You have a diverse sponsorship.
Yeah, sort of.
Hey, they're sponsoring. That's the main thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, Greg. Well, this has been awesome. I know I've enjoyed it. I've learned a ton. I know the audience will as well. So I appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want to learn more about how to use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence, make sure to sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Also, we'll be launching a course later this spring with more information to come. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can DM me on Twitter at rfordej or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.